and welcome to today's Wonder at Home event. I'm Lee Ryan, and I'm the head of the psychology department here at the University of Arizona. I'll be your host for today's panel. If our lives weren't stressful before the pandemic, the last 14 months has shown us just how stressful life can be. Many of us have lived through social isolation, financial hardship, illness, and even the deaths of family members and friends. And all of us have had to live with the ongoing uncertainty of what the next day would bring. So it's not surprising that we've seen increases in the number of people experiencing depression, anxiety, and poor sleep. Today, I've invited 3 distinguished professors in the psychology department to join us. They're all clinical psychologists and experts on the impact of stress on our health and well-being. I'll be asking them to help us understand how stress affects our lives, and most importantly, what we can do to improve our physical, mental, and emotional health. We'll begin with some brief introductions, followed by a few of my own questions to get us started. Then I'll ask the panelists to answer the questions that you submitted at registration. Remember that throughout the discussion, you'll be able to submit additional questions using the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can in our brief hour together before wrapping up with some final thoughts. So let's begin with our first panelist, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mary Frances O'Connor. I'm an associate professor and the director of clinical training here in the Department of Psychology at U of A. And my research focus has been for many, many years now on grief and loss, and particularly on the impact that it has on us physically as well as emotionally and mentally. And so it's been a time when some of my science skills have been in use this year. And I think I'll hand it off to you, Dave.
Great. Thank you, Mary Frances. Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Sbarra, also a professor in psychology and licensed clinical psychologist. I've been at the U of A for almost 17 years now. I study stress, health, and close relationships. Last year, starting in January, I was teaching a big undergraduate class in health psychology at the university. Come March, we shifted the whole class to make it COVID focused. And then I taught a class over the summer related to COVID and used the models of health psychology to try to understand a little bit better about what we're living through right now. I'll introduce our colleague, Daniel Taylor, to you next.
Hello, I'm also a professor here in the Department of Psychology at the University of Arizona. My research specializes in the epidemiology and treatment of insomnia and, to a lesser extent, other sleep disorders.
Great. So welcome to all 3 of you, and thanks for joining us today. So Dave, I'm going to start with you. And just to get us going, tell us about stress and worry and generally how it affects people's mental health. And I'm curious also if you've seen differences that have come about because of over this last year during the pandemic.
Sure. Okay. I'm happy to get us started and kick us off. I think the first place to start is really to begin understanding what is our emotional world like? What are our emotional experiences? Emotions, as you know them, happiness, sadness, anger, right? We have a common language for them, but they're information systems from the environment. So our emotional experience is the way we get information about the environment, whether it's good or bad. And when we think about aversive emotional experiences, those that are difficult or challenging for us, there are a couple of ways of looking at it. Stress is typically defined as the aversive emotional experience when we experience the challenges and demands of our daily lives as exceeding our resources to cope with those demands. So resources, demands greater than resources, and that's the experience of psychological stress. Another big one, of course, for many people over the pandemic is anxiety. And anxiety is aversive. It can be a pretty free-floating state of upsetness, generalized arousal about what's going to happen, what could happen, and sometimes what has happened, very closely related to what's going on in our heads about worry. whether or not we're worrying, whether or not we're focused on our thoughts are future oriented about what's going to happen. So I can say a lot more about this: stress, anxiety, worry. There's also loneliness, burnout, and grief. And we've certainly seen an uptick of these kinds of challenges over the course of the pandemic. In fact, I think the current evidence is that almost a third of people are feeling pretty significant anxiety and worry on a day-to-day basis, in the early part of 2021. So let me pause there and hand it off.
Okay. Wow. Thanks. So Daniel, we've heard a lot about people reporting problems with their sleep. That's your area of expertise. So, start off by telling us how sleep affects our mental health and other aspects of our lives. And how have you seen the last year impacting people's sleep?
So sleep disorders such as insomnia, which is difficulty falling or staying asleep, sleep deprivation, which is not quite the same thing as insomnia. Many people with insomnia aren't actually sleep deprived most nights. Shift work, sleep apnea, there's a variety of other sleep disorders out there. They're all generally considered risk factors for worse physical and mental health. And this includes depression, suicidality, and certain anxiety disorders, and even PTSD. For a lot of people, COVID significantly impacted their sleep. But I wouldn't say it was the majority. The majority of the population, it looks like actually their sleep got better during the COVID crisis. And some of that might be to the fact that they're not having to commute as much, so they could sleep in a little bit later. Perhaps they had a few less social responsibilities, or the kids weren't in quite as many events. So for a large degree of the population, it looks like sleep actually got a little better, like duration at least, during the COVID crisis. But if you had additional responsibilities, so small children that you also had to teach while doing your own job, or you were a healthcare worker, or perhaps ran a department, the amount of demands on your time actually went up quite a bit, as did the stress. And so for those folks, there was a much greater increase in insomnia symptoms, as well as oftentimes a decrease in sleep duration.
Cool. So at least for some people, there was a bit of a silver lining in all of this for their sleep. Right. Mary Frances, you're an expert in coping. And so tell us some of the ways that people cope with uncertainty and stress. And what have you seen over the last year that's helped people in particular? And are there things that people are doing that might actually make things worse?
Sure. I like this theory that Dave brought up, this idea that there are demands from our environment, and then there are resources, the sort of scale. You can tip the balance one way or the other. And I think that something that happens as we start worrying is that we just get stuck in the worrying. And, worry is very emotional. It feels very real, but it's all really about the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? And so worry, getting stuck there, can really maintain that anxiety and even lead to depression. So there's a concept that I find useful, which is the difference between seeking and solving. And so to seek a solution to something that may or may not happen in the future, we have to, think about it. But if we stop there, those thoughts just go round and round in our head and maybe keep us up at night. We have to move into problem solving. And then when we find a solution, or even a possible solution, stop the worry merry-go-round. We may not know if it's going to work. We may not know, if we can implement it right away. But when we come up with a solution, finding a way to get out of that merry-go-round, sometimes that means going out and taking a walk, you can put on the Bee Gees disco, whatever sort of gets you out of that state, helps you then to enact that solution later, but not stay in that mood the whole time. And so people who are able to kind of approach their worries this way are often more capable. If we address our problems by doing things like having that extra glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine, or just spending the weekend binge watching TV, all things we've done, if we stay there, then the worry just remains.
And we have seen that alcohol use has gone up really significantly over the last year, and that's a concern for a lot of people, right? Is that one of those things that is like things that people are trying that might not be so good for us?
I like to be very careful that, we use a wide range of coping strategies. And in small doses, there's nothing wrong with denial and avoidance and, just pretending the world isn't the way it is for a minute. The trouble is when that persists or when it actually prevents us from solving something. So we like to have a big toolkit of what we can do when we have problems, and that has to be a small set of them, along with things like having difficult conversations with your loved ones, which Dave may end up talking to us about, or finding ways to, decide to use an app to really motivate you to use more mindfulness or to exercise more or whatever. Using those problem strategies is really important.
Okay. And on that note, Dave, COVID-19 has had a big effect on all of our relationships. And that's your area of research. What have you seen and how do you think it's affecting our close relationships, particularly with the people who we live with?
Sure. Very good question. Very important question. Very timely question, of course. And especially, at least locally, as it feels like maybe our shutdown experience and lockdown experience is coming to an end. Everyone's taking a breath and sort of taking their temperature on the status of their relationships and where are things at, doing a reevaluation. So some of the best research on this topic has shown some pretty interesting findings. So there was a big study around the world called the Love in the Time of COVID study. So over 3,000 people, data collected all around the world. Study basically started in March of 2020. I was in awe of these people who did this work. They constituted a team, got right at it. And one of the things they were after was really trying to understand how the stress and worry, some of the concepts we've talked about already, related to COVID was impacting the quality of our relationships. If we back up one step, all of us in the psychology department, when we consider some of the, really bedrock findings in our field, one of them is that high quality relationships are associated with good health, good physical health, good mental health, and are deeply related to our happiness. So we're really interested in what's happening to the quality of these relationships for people who are locked down. So stress, COVID-related stress, degrading the quality of our relationships. That's one thing. But the other part is that it is offset or buffered by the extent to which people feel that their partners are responsive to their needs. So, if I'm managing all the COVID-related stressors of, say, teaching my class online, but I get the sense that my wife really understands what I'm going through, she's curious about it, she values what I'm doing, and I do the same for her, our relationship is a little more insulated. So the finding was basically you can have high COVID-related stress, but the effects on your relationship are diminished, taken away, buffered, insulated by this responsivity that partners have for each other, which I think is pretty significant. One topic also that would be worthwhile coming back to or talking about, depending on what the folks in the community are wanting, would also be to discuss loneliness and the perception that you are, the experience that you are isolated even among a crowd, and social isolation itself. But I'll leave it here for now and we can come back to it if it comes up.
Well, I was actually going to ask Mary Frances something similar to that. Mary Frances, many people have experienced loss over the past year, including the death of beloved family and friends, but also loss of the physical connectedness, being separated physically and isolated from the people who we love. And that has led to an incredible increase in loneliness, both of those things. So, leading on from what Dave was talking about, how is that affecting people?
You're right. It affects people a lot. And the mortality rate from COVID this year has meant that for each death that has happened, we know that 9 people have lost a grandparent or a parent or a spouse or a child or sibling. And so that's an awful lot of people in the country who are now coping with grief. And when we come down to it, grief is where we lose something that is a part of us. It's a part of the way we function in the world. So the word mother implies two people, right? So the way that overlap happens when something is ripped away from us, we have really strong reactions to that. But notably, the reactions that we have are really different. There's a great quote that someone in my field uses, which is the idea that grief is the form that love takes when someone has died. So if you think about the myriad different relationships that you have, the different ways that you love people, then you're going to have a myriad different kinds of grief as well. So the experience of grief is universal. We know through cross-cultural studies that the experience of grief is universal, but the expression of grief, what we do with that, looks very, very different. If you take a blankie away from a toddler, they may scream at you or bite you. If you have a teenager who loses a friend to suicide, they may completely withdraw and may not want to talk about it. And the full gamut in between, being weepy when we're not intending to be weepy. And so if you think about it this way, we have to also keep in mind that the secondary stressors are impacting us, like Dave was saying. And so we know that mortality rates have been much higher in our Latino, Black, and Native communities. And thus, enduring grief while we're also enduring other stressors like loss of a job, housing insecurity, a feeling of not being safe in the world because of gun violence or other things, those affect then our ability to process the loss of this part of us in the world. So those are some ways that we think about grief, and I'm sure we all know that they affect sleep as well.
So Daniel, I know that you have been at the forefront of developing online resources for helping people with sleep problems, with insomnia. We're on Zoom right now. We've all been using the internet and learning to use apps for all kinds of things, and including telehealth and treatment like the one that you've developed for sleep problems. How do you think going forward technology is going to change, and how much of a role is it going to play in the provision of mental health services? Is it good? Is it bad? Or is it somewhere in between?
I think ultimately it's good. I mean, for one, it's actually made it a lot easier to get therapy for insomnia through telehealth. There are actually not a lot of trained therapists out there in the world that are expert in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is considered the first line treatment. The University of Arizona is lucky. It's one of the world leaders in this type of therapy. So people in this general area have a lot of resources, but others, particularly if they're in rural areas, don't often get to access the same level of care. So telehealth is really breaking down that barrier, even across state lines, as licensing rules are starting to be loosened a bit. And so we can start practicing across state lines. There's also been a proliferation of websites where patient can go and get computerized therapy. So it's the same version, but it's a little bit diminished. The effects are about half as large as if they got the treatment from a live therapist, but it is considered sort of a stepped care model. Finally, there's also been a proliferation of apps that can help track sleep and deliver some of the components of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, such as relaxation. These are helpful, but they're really not a substitute for therapy. It's equivalent to taking an adequate dose of an over-the-counter pain medication and then being surprised when it doesn't, completely remove the pain. And it also might make the patient a little bit resistant to future treatment because they think this doesn't really work.
Great. And, from my own experience, I'm a big user of apps for various, kind of helping apps for my health, where I never did that before. So I stopped going to the gym at the beginning of the pandemic, I now use an online exercise app, which I think is fantastic. And I also started using a meditation app that helps with guided meditation. And those things are changing our lives, right? And we're becoming so much more open to trying those. And some of them are really, really good. Dave or Mary Frances, did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to say that we are going to put some of the links to these types of resources on the U of A College of Science website that you'll receive if you had registered for this workshop today. So you can find some of the ones that we think are particularly useful and helpful.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I would add one more thing. I mean, would really be, I guess when we think about how psychology and our psychological experience gets under the skin to impact our health, one of the things we need to do is have a bridge from the mind to the body. And sleep is that bridge, is one of those main bridges. And so, for example, one of the big theories about loneliness is that it's a psychological state that alerts you to your social standing, because over the course of our evolutionary history, being on the social periphery was actually dangerous, like you suffered risk for predation. So this perspective, the vigilance that is associated with loneliness, so the theory goes, also interrupts sleep efficiency, and increases sleep fragmentation. And through disturbed sleep, you get from the psychological experience into the body to alter these health outcomes. So we're trying to look at things holistically to really create a big picture of, what does well-being mean and how do we think about our mental health and our physical health as tied together.
Great. I want to turn to some questions about what do we do about these things. Mary Frances, I'll start with you, but anyone can jump in. We know generally that people are actually very resilient in the face of difficulties. And yet we know that some people struggle. And we've seen this over the last year. So what's your advice to people who continue to struggle with mental health issues, even as our life at least begins to return back to normal again?
I like to make a distinction between sort of the acute distress and suffering that happens in the midst of something like what we're experiencing right now, but in other situations as well, post 9/11, or as an individual, if you're going through a natural disaster. I like to make a distinction between that sort of acute distress and then some of the longer lasting effects that we're really not even yet sure what they will be in this country. We can predict that there will be an increase in mental health issues, but of course, this is an empirical question. Part of the point of having academics and scientists is to actually survey randomly in order to get a sense of what is the prevalence of these things, like Daniel and Dave have been talking about studies that are ongoing even today. The reason that I make a distinction between sort of the acute stress and the longer term issues is because the acute stress for most of us will actually go away as things return to normal eventually. Now, I say eventually because it takes our brain time to form new neural synapses in order to make a change in what we do day to day. It takes time for those processes to be built in our brain, and that will take us time then before it shows up in our behavior. So if we think about the acute distress, which is distressing, it's sort of like, the stress ball. When you it's not that you don't expect the stress ball to get clamped down on, but you just know that it's going to come back to its usual shape, that one is going to go on and recreate a meaningful life. That's distinct from the longer term impacts, where someone continues to have thoughts of, say, wanting to hurt themselves or wishing they weren't here anymore, or when a person is unable to engage in their job or in school in the way that they used to, they withdraw from their friends. those are longer term issues that often do require some sort of professional intervention. And seeking that out, or for the people who care for these individuals, helping them to seek that out can be really critical, because those trajectories can change as well, but often require some intervention.
And for those of you who are listening in the audience, I encourage you to submit your questions on the Q&A if you have other things that you'd like to hear about that I haven't asked yet. Dave, that leads me to think about the return to work. And this was actually also a question from one of the registrants, that, employers are hoping and expecting that we're going to return to work probably by the fall, at least at this university. That's the expectation. But we know this isn't going to be easy for anyone, as Mary Frances pointed out. So as we move to re-enter the workplace and engage in the things that we did pre-pandemic, what can we do to cope with that? And also, what can employers do to make it easier for people to make that transition back into the workplace?
Sure. Very, very good question. And let me try to connect it to some of Mary Frances's commentary also. I think she raises the critical point of functional impairment. Well, what do clinical psychologists mean when they say functional impairment? We just mean impairments in the activities of daily life, one of which will be going back to work. How hard is it to go back to work? How much anxiety do you experience? How much avoidance do you engage in? How much do you try and then, get back in your car and say, I'm not going to do this? How much do you plan about it? And so really monitoring yourself in that way as a starting point for thinking about how difficult or challenging is this for me? For nearly everyone who's been at home for the better part of the year, I expect that this will be quite challenging. And this also is a key point about what Mary Frances is saying, that there's nothing pathological about experiencing anxiety or challenge. It's going to be anxiety producing for most of us. And I think the general approach is one that most clinical psychologists would advise, is to treat it in some sort of graded step fashion. So start out by going in a few hours, start out by working a reduced schedule a little bit. Just go in and be there and get your office assembled, or get your workspace assembled, or just drive there. So we think of these and we call them exposures. We need to expose ourselves to the anxiety, but importantly, really important, we need to come to the conclusion that we manage the anxiety. So I went in, I drove in, I sat in my office, I was there, and it was okay, and I can cope with whatever happens, including sort of the kinds of things we feel slightly silly about wanting to experience. I don't want to have to talk to everyone about how their COVID year was. I just don't, I want to be there and go in and do some work. I don't want to talk to you about how was your pandemic? Oh, my pandemic, right? So you expose yourself to that. And you need to also evaluate that the bad thing didn't happen. I went in, I managed it okay, it can be okay. And if you can do that, even when a bad thing sometimes does happen, you'll be really off to a good start. And I would also think that from the workplace perspective, we just need to have compassion and grace for each other and recognize that we're lifting off, and, it was hard to go out and it's hard to come back. And we need to allow space for all kinds of different experiences. And, I think there is a both and way of being in the world, really trying to keep people accountable for coming back into the office, while also understanding that it can be a struggle, it will be a struggle for most people.
Right. And, from my own experience, my staff and I have started having meetings in person on Thursday mornings. The first Thursday morning, it was only less than a month ago that we had the first meeting. We met outside under the trees. We all had our Starbucks with us, and everyone was really anxious. And it was such a positive experience to be with those people face to face. I've been meeting with these people on Zoom all year, multiple times. It's not the same. And so looking for that positive experience as well that you might not expect, which is really good. I think one of the things from my point of view as the head of the department that's very important is to continue to understand the need for flexibility. The question from the registrant was, what can employers do? And from my point of view, you need to talk to each individual and understand that they are still going through a lot of things. And those things, as Mary Frances said, aren't going to go away overnight. Right. And we need to be open and flexible and provide sort of individualized support. So that's my view of what I hope employers will do. Daniel, back to sleep. So many of us have experienced sleep problems, some maybe not so much during the pandemic, others gone way up over the last year, and especially for those of us who are getting older. So what advice can you give us, and what resources would you recommend to people? And in particular, I'm curious about, what is something that Mary Frances touched on earlier. What's the point at which someone says, okay, my sleep is out of control and I really need to seek professional help? What's the difference?
So I'm going to answer the last question last and start with the first question. So, first of all, evidence shows that people who have irregular sleep-wake schedules actually have a weakening of their circadian rhythm signals, which are really part of what controls when and how we sleep. So the number one advice I always give people is to try to maintain a regular wake schedule. So try to get up at the same time every day, even on the weekends. This will really keep your circadian rhythm strong, help you stay on track. We each have sort of a different sleep-wake allowance. So if you're a 6-hour-a-night sleeper, that means you have a wake of allowance of about 18 hours. So if you wake up at the same time every day, at about 18 hours, a little before that, you should get sleepy and be able to fall asleep every night. The second thing I always tell them is to only use the bedroom for sleep or sex. They should remove everything out of the bedroom that's not associated with one of those two things. This means TVs, phones, laptops, even books and tablets, all of that. You need to get it all out of the room because all those things begin to associate the bedroom with something other than sleep or sex. So we really want to get those out. Finally, I always tell folks, you don't go to bed until you're sleepy. You don't try to guess when you're going to get sleepy. You don't try to trick yourself into falling asleep. You just wait until you're sleepy to go to bed. Now, if you've spent a long time trying to recapture some of that lost sleep, you might not actually know when you're sleepy. For each of us, it's different. For me, it's when I'm reading a book in the chair and I start to nod off. I know then I can probably go to the bedroom and fall asleep. There might be some fits and starts while you try to learn your signals for being sleepy and able to fall asleep. So one way to handle this is if you find yourself having difficulty falling and staying asleep in the room, when you do finally go to bed, you need to know that maybe your signals aren't quite right. So you need to look for new signals. But it's also really important that you never spend more than about a quarter hour awake in bed trying to sleep. You should just get up and go to another room and give up and don't go back to bed until you're sleepy. These things take time to work, though. You shouldn't expect things to get better immediately. If you've had insomnia like most people who've had insomnia, they've had it for years. It's not a relatively new experience. So if you've had it for years, you can't reasonably expect to start doing these new habits and your sleep to change immediately. That would be like expecting the fact that I haven't gone to the gym in a year, but I'm going to go today and I'm going to be back into shape immediately. I'm good to go. So these things take time to sort of kick in. Typically, it takes a few weeks for these types of habits to really kick in and improve your sleep. Now, if you're having insomnia and these things don't work, and you're having it at least 3 nights a week, it's taking you, at least 30 minutes to fall asleep, or you're up in the middle of the night for at least 30 minutes, 3 nights or more a week, that's assuming you have daytime complaints as well, that's considered diagnosable insomnia. So if people are interested in more resources for that, we have a lot locally, we have a lot nationally. As I mentioned earlier, there's some online resources. I've put those all on our website at the University of Arizona. So I've built a website here within the department called insomnia.arizona.edu. www.wonder.edu/treatment. So it should be relatively easy to find, but we'll also provide those resources on this website that we'll be doing for Wonder at Home.
That's awesome. Yes. Just to remind everyone that we will be sending to all the participants today a list of all of these resources and materials, as well as you'll have a link to actually see this videotape of today's session, and you can share it with people. There's a great question from one of our audience members, and I'm going to open it up to all three of you, because actually all four of us have been doing something that maybe we didn't do very much before, which is teach online. And for students who have had to move online, both young children and our students at the university, for some of them, it's been a really good experience, and others not so much. So what do you think the difference is, and just how has this impacted long-term our students?
I would start by an experience that I had, if that's all right. Students got sort of a bad, and undergrads often got a bad rap during COVID. And there were some behaviors they engaged in, which perhaps not surprisingly weren't very health promoting. But I worked with a group of undergraduates who participated in the contact tracing that the Pima County Health Department was doing. So contacting people who had had a positive test result to determine how they might have contracted it, and giving them good, solid advice about what to do with quarantine and isolation. And these undergraduates, who were mostly upperclassmen, juniors and seniors, were doing this as a part of research credit. And in this, we were asking them to phone people in the community of all stripes and shapes, and to ask them quite personal questions about their experience of symptoms, their social contacts, and so forth. And for many of them in the class, the idea of phoning a stranger was overwhelmingly anxiety-provoking. But they shared a common motivation. They wanted to be a part of a strategy to help with what was going on. And it was this motivation for the outcome that persisted, plus the social cohesion of encouraging each other, I have to say, that really made them persist in making these phone calls, difficult conversations. And when they wrote their reflective papers at the end of the semester, they said this exposure to having to do it for something they wanted to do, but nonetheless were very anxious about it, that exposure changed the way they were able to interact in the world, so that it was because of that they found they could actually speak up in class, or they could speak to someone in a social situation, or have a difficult conversation with a family member about health promoting activities. So I think exposure is often the way, and for some that does take some professional intervention, but for many of us it's the social support of encouraging them to do it.
Right. Dave, there's a question that I think is a really important issue, and it comes from one of our audience members who asks about the kind of unique sort of stress that has been experienced by people who live alone. Can you talk about that? You're an expert on relationships,
Sure.
But what
I'll talk about it. First of all, I would like to just acknowledge the sort of ground truth of that question. It's incredibly painful and stressful to be alone. I think Mary Frances will have a good amount to say on this too, because she's been conducting virtual groups for people who are socially isolated and more limited. But in general, I think that the approach we want to take, similar to the one Mary Frances was just talking about, is trying to be other-oriented, trying to serve other people. And this sometimes runs counterintuitive if we feel depressed or anxious, or we feel that we are in need of care. And so taking steps to reach out in a way that makes a just noticeable difference, or seems like a minimally effective thing that might change your mood around, is very important. Now, so, okay, talking practically, what do I mean? I mean calling people on the phone. I mean, if you're not Zoomed out, getting on a Zoom with people. One of the silver linings that some folks have talked about, including, I think you, Lee, mentioned this, that getting back in touch with old friends, having Zoom celebration. I've seen some of my, sort of distant family more in the pandemic than I might have. And looking for opportunities to get out physically. Being outside is restorative. It's important for our eyes and our bodies. So getting outside, and if that means, later in the evening in Tucson or earlier in the morning, finding times to get outside. So I think in general, I really do advocate trying to think through and set in motion a set of strategies that might help you move out of feeling so isolated, and then go ahead and test them out. I'm going to call X people. I'm going to set up a Zoom. I'm going to invite a friend to walk. I'm going to walk myself. These may not be the things for you, but they're the ideas in general. And yeah, I'll stop there.
It's a great topic to discuss. Daniel, I have a great question for you. You had talked about online telehealth and telemedicine and treatment for insomnia. And one of our registrants has asked, how do you know a good one from a not so good one? Are there clinical studies that actually validate these online programs and treatment programs? And how do you know? How do you know which one's a good one and which one isn't?
Yeah, so there's research, and I saw one of the questions they asked about the validity of telehealth versus in-person, and there's good research that's been coming out that telehealth is equivalent to in-person for CBT for insomnia. We actually finished one of those studies here, one of the PIs from over the medical school, and we did it in folks who were actually recently discharged from the hospital, and it's showing up that telehealth is as good, if not a little better, because then you don't have to deal with the commute, finding parking, all of those sort of things. In terms of the online websites, in general, they're all pretty equivalent. The CBT for insomnia ones, and I've listed them all on my website, the ones that are they've been validated through randomized clinical trials. They're all fairly equivalent. As I mentioned before, they're all about half as good as in-person. But if you don't want to do in-person, there was the comment earlier about students. Not everyone wants to do in-person. Perhaps they'd like to try the online one, which I think is a good step care approach. Try the online one. If it works for you, great. There's some free ones there. There's some that cost money. There's some that are veteran specific. Try it first. If it works, great. If it doesn't, don't give up, right? There's a reason why, we've been doing this, or I've been doing this for 25 years. I know things the website doesn't. I can adapt. If you're a shift worker, if you're a nurse, if you're an EMT, if you're a firefighter, there's adaptations that need to be made a lot of times, and the website just can't handle that. There's a degree of logic there that if it was that smart, we might be a little scared of it.
Thanks.
Daniel, what do you mean? Can I ask just to follow up? Can you say what you mean by stepped care? Because some people may not be familiar with the term.
So stepped care is, you provide the smallest, the minimal acceptable dose to as many people as possible, population-wide, and that might help a large portion of them. And then maybe the rest can then try the next minimal dose, which might be online. So the first minimal dose might be the app, like Dr. Ryan was talking about earlier. The next minimal dose might be online. The next minimal dose might be telehealth. The next minimal dose means they need to come into the sleep disorder center. We need to do an overnight sleep study to make sure they're not having obstructive sleep apnea at night or periodic limb movement disorder, other things that are sort of interfering. And then there's also the whole, career choice level of some people might need to change careers if they really want their sleep to get better.
So that's really helpful. And again, we're going to be providing resources and lists of resources to people. And if any of you have questions about what's a good one and what isn't, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. So I'm going to start wrapping up a little bit, and I'm going to ask our panelists to do something really difficult, which is to give their final thoughts in 1-2 sentences max. Like, if there's something that is your take-home message to the people who are listening today, what would it be? So Mary Frances, I'll go with you first.
Sure. I think when I think of dealing with the pandemic, and I've primarily been dealing with bereaved individuals who've dealt with really difficult situations across this last 14 months. I think a piece of advice, that something you can say to a bereaved person that makes a big impact, is you're actually doing really well. And I think that applies more broadly. I think giving each other and ourselves a little compassion around the things we've been trying, the ways we've gotten through, if you ate McDonald's because you could do it through the drive-through, that's okay, right? 14 months is not going to kill you. So the idea that you're doing as well as you possibly can and supporting each other, I think, is the most important thing from my perspective.
Daniel, you want to go next?
Sure. It's evolutionarily appropriate to not sleep well during periods of high distress. If there was a lion outside your cave and you slept like a rock, you wouldn't have passed on your genes. The problem that we run into with insomnia is a lot of times people do things to cope with the insomnia that then maintain the insomnia. So they start chasing sleep, as we say. They start spending more time in bed, just laying in bed all the time, hoping they can trick sleep. They also start taking too much caffeine, or they start worrying about sleep all the time. Sleep is part of our bodies. If we don't interfere with it, it will come back. We tend to accommodate to stress, or we find ways to cope with it. So my main thing is to try not to do things that are going to maintain your insomnia. And so that's why I say, keep your sleep time regular. Don't go to bed until you're sleepy. Don't do random things in your bedroom and associate it with those things. So that's really my main message.
Okay, the simple things really do help. Dave, you get the last word.
Gosh, Mary Frances almost stole mine, but they're very similar. So read my mind. We have a generation of stress, coping, and trauma work to understand how people fare when they face very, very difficult situations, including other pandemics. And the sort of basic take-home message from this is that in almost every way or any way you look at it, humans are resilient to a wide variety of psychosocial adversities. And resilience means coping and coming out of the experience as well as, and sometimes better than, when you went in. And this is more of the rule than the exception. And this is my sort of final thought, because it's something to hang our hat on. It's something to look forward to. It's something to be optimistic about. And I find it very hopeful, is that all this science really tells us that we have the kind of capacity we may not always tune into. And that's there for us. And it doesn't come easy. It's hard won. And that's what we've been through. And we have a lot to look forward to. So I really do have a more optimistic, resilient focus.
And on that very positive note, I want to give thanks to our panelists and to all of you in the audience who joined us today. As I said earlier, a recording of today's panel discussion will be available. I understand it's not going to go out until next week, so it'll take a couple of days, but it's going to be sent out to all of you as well as links to additional resources. So thanks for joining us today, and stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care.